Hey everyone, and welcome aboard to another video. Earlier this year, I took a trip to Chicago to film for several long-distance Amtrak train videos that I'm working on. On one of the days, I filmed a bunch of different trains on the Canadian Pacific Railroad line that runs in between the northern suburbs of Chicago and Milwaukee. So, in a similar spirit to a video I did earlier this year on trains in Seattle, Washington, I thought I'd once again take you along and show you all the trains I filmed on this day on this busy passenger and freight rail corridor in the Midwest. I started off the day early in the morning at a place known as Rondout. I had received word from several friends that a Canadian Pacific freight train with a specially painted locomotive was making its way toward Chicago. Not knowing the territory as well as I do out west, I decided to scout out a few locations prior to the arrival of the train. The rail line is known as Canadian Pacific's Chicago and Milwaukee Subdivision, or the C&M for short. It was once owned by the Milwaukee Road and carried the famous express Hiawatha passenger trains between Chicago and the Twin Cities. In 1986, the Milwaukee Road was merged with the Soo Line, a subsidiary of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. Today, the route sees Amtrak's Empire Builder and Hiawatha passenger trains and Metra commuter trains to Chicago alongside a number of daily Canadian Pacific freight trains. Rondout marks an important junction on the Chicago to Milwaukee line. Here, northbound Metra trains split off to head to Fox Lake. It also marks the transition of line ownership. The portion of the C&M between Rondout and Milwaukee is owned by the Canadian Pacific, while the section from Rondout into Chicago is owned by Metra, although CP dispatches the entire subdivision. Rondout is also the location where the former Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad, now owned by the Canadian National Railway, crosses over the C&M Sub. Rondout Interlocking Tower, built over a century ago, still stands at the junction, although it has been closed since March of 2015. Passing over the C&M Sub is the former right-of-way of the North Shore Line Electric Interurban Railroad, which has now been repurposed as a recreational trail. Old searchlight signals stand guard over Rondout. However, these will soon be replaced as part of a major Metra triple tracking project in the area. Just a few months after these scenes were captured, replacement signals were installed awaiting activation. With no trains in the immediate vicinity, I moved a little to the south to Lake Forest, Illinois. I set up at the railroad crossing just north of the Lake Forest Metra station. A while after my arrival, northbound Amtrak Hiawatha train number 331 passed by heading from Chicago to Milwaukee. A short while later, the first southbound Hiawatha for Chicago, train 332, headed through. This train had a second locomotive instead of a cab car. Amtrak 50th Anniversary P42 locomotive 161 in the Phase 1 livery is on the tail end of the train. Since Hiawatha trains have short layovers between turning, one locomotive and one cab car are typically placed on each of the two train sets used for this service. Metra commuter train Sunday service number 2604 arrived into Lake Forest on time at 9:20 a.m. Pushing this train toward Chicago was Metra F59 PHI locomotive 88, formerly Amtrak 465. This and 20 other locomotives of this type were purchased from EMD in 2018 following the end of a 20-year lease to Amtrak. Just a few minutes later, northbound Metra train 2601, the first northbound of the day, made a station stop. Another former Amtrak F-59 was powering this train as it headed for Fox Lake. As the commuter train disappeared in the distance, I found out I still had a little time before the freight train I was looking for showed up. I ended up relocating a little ways to the north to Wadsworth, Illinois and the Wadsworth Road grade crossing. I arrived with no time to spare as a northbound Canadian Pacific grain train went thundering by. We are back on the Canadian Pacific-owned section of the railroad. I didn't have much more waiting to do as the train I was looking for showed up just a little while later at 10:30 a.m. This was train 248, a regularly scheduled mixed freight manifest that brings cars from St. Paul, Minnesota to the Belt Railway of Chicago for interchange. CP 8781, the leading locomotive, was painted in a special orange scheme to recognize a container intermodal shipper. With word that train 248 would be holding just to the south while some passenger train traffic cleared, I moved back down the line to Deerfield, Illinois. Once again, another northbound Canadian Pacific freight train came through just moments after I arrived. This was likely train number 149, a mixed container, intermodal, and autorack train that takes cars from Canadian Pacific's Bensonville Yard just west of Chicago across the border and into Canada. Metra train 2608 approached the Deerfield station with the same equipment set I saw earlier on train 2601. Not 2 minutes later, Metra train 2603 departed Deerfield on time at 11:26 a.m. behind an MP 36 locomotive. This was the second of 3 equipment sets in the Sunday service rotation. Just a few minutes later, northbound Amtrak Hiawatha Train 333 headed north with the 50th anniversary locomotive leading and an SC-44 Charger on the other end. Amtrak painted 2 of its former F40PH locomotive-turned-cab cars in a special scheme to honor U.S. veterans. Non-powered control unit 90221 in the Veterans Scheme led southbound train 334 through Deerfield. Finally, with all the passenger traffic cleared, Train 248 continued its journey toward Chicago. Once Train 248 had passed, I took a short lunch break and then headed for Round Lake, Illinois to catch one of the Metra F59s on a train bound for Fox Lake. Metra Train 2607 disappeared as I made my way back west and north, this time heading into Wisconsin. Showing up at the Waterford Avenue grade crossing on the south side of Milwaukee, Hiawatha Train 338 made its way south with the Veterans Cab Car leading the way. After a little bit of a wait, a northbound manifest approached the crossing. This was likely a second section or a late first section of train number 249. 249 is the reverse counterpart of train 248, taking cars from the Belt Railway of Chicago to St. Paul, Minnesota. The manifest cleared, and a southbound grain train with BNSF power on the head end began to accelerate. The grain train didn't quite clear in time to allow for an unobstructed view of westbound Amtrak train number 7, the Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon bound Empire Builder. I made the decision to very quickly relocate to the west side of the Milwaukee Amtrak station. We are now in the Milwaukee neighborhood of Story Hill on the Canadian Pacific Toma Subdivision, which travels between Milwaukee and Portage, Wisconsin. Train 249 also made a brief stop in Milwaukee to allow the Empire Builder to overtake it. After making its station stop, Train 7 continued west behind a pair of General Electric P42 DC locomotives. These units are in the process of being phased out on the Empire Builder as more new Siemens ALC 42 Charger locomotives enter service. With Amtrak 7 cleared, Train 249 continued its journey north and west. By this point in 2022, CP was well into its planned merger with the Kansas City Southern Railway, and KCS locomotives were frequently seen on Canadian Pacific freight trains. KCS ES44 series locomotive 4786 made some noise as it accelerated out of the curve. I returned to downtown Milwaukee to catch the next northbound Hiawatha train into the station. Amtrak 161 was back once again on the point of train 337 as it crossed the old swing bridge at the confluence of the Milwaukee and Menominee rivers. The train made an on-time arrival into Milwaukee at 4:44 p.m. While Milwaukee remained as the last stop for the Hiawatha in 2022, there was growing talk of expanding the service to Madison, Wisconsin and the Twin Cities. This bridge over the Menominee River was built in 1904 and at the time of this video was one of only a handful of bobtail swing bridges still standing in the U.S. Unlike most swing bridges, bobtail bridges are positioned on their main rotating pier with one end sticking out much farther than the other short end. The shorter, stubby end is what gives bobtail swing bridges their name. Returning to Waterford Avenue, the same train set I just saw in downtown Milwaukee headed to Chicago as train 340. A nearly 4-hour late Amtrak Train 8 passed by a few minutes behind Train 340. Chicago was less than an hour and a half away. About a half hour later, Train 339 rolled north behind an Illinois state-owned Siemens Charger. As I was getting ready to call it a day, I was surprised by one more train. CP-2316, a rebuilt GP-20C Eco locomotive, led local freight I-61 south. This local works several industries along the C&M Sub out of Milwaukee. The local crossed under Interstate 94 and by the Milwaukee airport, bringing my day trip to a close. Thanks for joining me for this look at trains on the C&M Subdivision. As always, a big thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by leaving me a comment down below and hitting the like button. For regular notifications every time I post to YouTube, click on the subscribe button and select the Receive All Notifications option. There's even more train and railroad themed content on my other social media pages, and I'll be back next Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time for an all-new railroading adventure right here on the YouTube channel. That's it for now. Until next time, I'm Mike Armstrong. I'll see you down the line. Thanks for watching.